Alan Schwarz, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, it's really great to have you. We're going to be discussing your book, ADHD Nation, ADHD Nation, and I forgot the subtitle, Children, Doctors, Big Pharma. Yes, the Making of an American Epidemic. It's a really punchy title. And I came across it in the New York Times review of literature, something like that, the literary review of books. That's it. And I didn't actually read the review. Hopefully it was a good one, but I didn't want to bias myself one way or another. Were you happy with the review?
I'm actually the same way. If I'm going to watch a movie or read a book, I would rather have it come fresh to me
Yeah.
and make my own judgment. So I applaud you.
Thank you.
But I would encourage you. It was a very good review. It was called Required Reading for anyone who cares about children's mental health.
Yeah, great. And also, you've been a New York Times reporter, speaking of the New York Times, and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, which that sounds pretty exciting. What was that for?
From 2007 through 2011, and I hate to sound self-aggrandizing, but I was the guy who exposed the dangers of concussions and the mishandling of head injuries in the National Football League and elsewhere. It's, of course, become a very big national issue, but I and the New York Times were really at the forefront of investigating the dangers of the injuries, really analyzing how the National Football League handled and, more importantly, mishandled the science of them, and set the national conversation on a more healthy course. And we're really quite proud of that.
Yeah, you're really a hero, I think, in that regard. I think it was yesterday, I was just clicking through channels and happened on a football game that I really didn't watch. It was a collegiate football game, and this player was kicked out because he made a tackle. I guess there's a rule now that they should have their head up. He had his head down and really head-butted the guy he was tackling in the head, and he was kicked out of the game.
Well, there have been some safety reforms since.
Yeah.
There were some safety reforms, of course, long before we showed up, but
Yeah.
the concern about head-to-head contact and all contact to the head, of course, intensified through the reporting that we did and thereafter. So yeah, a lot of rules have changed, a lot of protocol has changed to keep athletes of any age safer.
Yeah, that's great. It must have been painful to be a finalist and not get it. What was the story?
There were 3 finalists, and I was one of them.
What was the story that ended up getting the prize?
There was a Los Angeles Times investigation or expose on government corruption in the town of Bell, California. The category that it was being considered in was public service. And there were, let's just say, some differing opinions on the extent to which the LA Times really contributed, to the wide public benefit versus our concussion series. But that's the way the ball bounces.
Yeah, it does. Personally, I think yours is a bigger story. They even made a movie starring Will Smith, and I thought it was quite enjoyable.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. Well, let's get into your book, ADHD Nation. What was it that propelled you in that direction to look into that topic?
After the concussion series, I wanted to do something different, and I had gotten a taste of what it was like to improve health and safety for lots of people. I mean, I had the privilege of doing that.
Yeah.
And so I was interested in seeing if there was anything else that needed any sort of similar treatment. And I did come across the fact that there were kids at my old high school and others like it who were abusing and even snorting Adderall before the SATs.
Wow.
In order to, at least in their minds, concentrate and perform better. And I was, horrified at this, not because anything having to do with ADHD or anything having to do even with Adderall, really. To me, it was an academic pressure story. It was, what are we doing to these kids to compel them to do something this dangerous? And it was only in doing the story through an academic pressure lens that it became incredibly clear that the system through which the medications enter the school's bloodstream and adolescent bloodstream, by which I mean the ADHD diagnostic process, was being mishandled to an absurd extent. And all the powers that be said, no, there are no problems at all. What you're talking about doesn't happen. And frankly, it didn't differ that much from the National Football League's messaging.
Yeah.
It started first being an issue. And so I was, pretty compelled to look deeper. And wherever I looked, it became clear that the system of ADHD diagnosis and treatment in the United States has gone well beyond the good faith and important effort to treat legitimately ADHD kids and help presumably improve their lives and prospects for a better future, well beyond that to encompass millions of kids who are diagnosed with this serious condition that they probably don't have.
Yeah. Before we go further, you're not a psychiatrist, you're not a psychologist. So to kind of establish your credentials for this story, what kind of research did you conduct?
Well, again, and as you said, of course, I am not a doctor or physician, and none of this interview should be interpreted in any way as official medical advice. You should speak with a professional to deal with any particular situation in your own life, whether it's yours or your child's. But in terms of my research, again, I wasn't a doctor when I helped the concussion world, okay? And it doesn't take a medical license to look at data and to analyze illogical arguments and to demand answers from people who don't really want to give them. So in this case, yes, I've interviewed more than 1,000 people, doctors, parents, patients, pharmaceutical executives, teachers, goodness knows.
Yeah, I just wanted to get that into the record because I read that in the book and I thought, wow,
this is
interviews.
On things. This is well, I'll let the reviewers tell you what it is. The New Yorker called it a dazzling piece of journalism, and I'm happy to say that that's how it has been received by people who know what journalism is. A lot of people don't. So, what I have tried to strike is the balance between having the ADHD construct exist and having medications available to people, usually kids, who are properly diagnosed and given proper messaging to all of them, but then not going so far as to diagnose millions of children beyond what is appropriate when they have problems, and we have to care about them and have to try to help.
Yeah.
Those problems often do not derive from ADHD. They can derive from other things, the hyperactivity, impulsivity, inattention that form the pillars of ADHD. Those behaviors can come about in children from things other than ADHD. They can come from anxiety, from bad diet, from poor exercise, from sleep disorders, trauma, parents splitting up, two sets of parents coming together, and all of a sudden you have 3 half brothers.
Yeah. So you're not saying that ADHD, you say it's a part of the subtitle is the making of an American epidemic. So you're not saying that ADHD is unreal.
No, the first line
saying
of the book
that it doesn't exist.
that ADHD exists, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
Okay, yeah, you do come out very strongly on that.
The epidemic in this case is not ADHD. The epidemic in this case is the ADHD misdiagnosis, where the American Psychiatric Association makes very clear in its official definition and diagnostic guidelines for ADHD, the official how-to guide,
Yeah.
right, says flatly that ADHD affects about 5% of children. Okay, let's just take them on faith that that is a reasonable estimate. They didn't make that estimate lightly. That's after decades of surveying different studies, different population assessments, all these deliberations and fights among all the experts. That's where they've come down, is about 5%. Now, of course,
that's even worldwide, right? Not just in the U.S.
Say, in most cultures.
In most cultures, okay.
And given that the DSM is basically for the United States, many other countries use the international classification,
Right.
Which has a considerably more strict set of diagnostic criteria, leading to lower rates of the disorder of diagnosis.
Okay.
Disorder elsewhere. But, in this case, look, no one should expect the system to function perfectly. This is a diagnosis that's very complicated, very difficult to diagnose properly. It is subjective. I'm not using that as a derogatory term. Frankly, concussions are subjective also. They don't have a magic X-ray. They don't have a brain scan or a blood test that can make a definitive diagnosis. That doesn't mean that we don't do our best with the construct. So I think that, yes, given all the forces involved, which perhaps we will get into later, I think most people could probably live with something more than 5%. If we live in the real world, maybe it'll be 7, maybe it'll be 8. But the thing is, right now, is 15% of children get diagnosed with ADHD. 15%, 20% of all American boys get diagnosed with this very serious condition, well beyond millions of kids.
Millions.
Beyond what should be and can be. We've just gone way beyond that in telling millions of kids that, and I'm sorry if this sounds mean, but that there's something wrong with your brain. I mean, that's what it is. We're telling millions of kids there's something wrong with your brain when there probably isn't.
Yeah.
And, they're not getting the help that they need. They're getting a diagnosis and medication that is either not appropriate for their situation or can actually exacerbate it. So I think what I'm demanding is more of a balance, allowing the construct to exist, because let's face it, it ain't going nowhere. And people are, the medications are not going to be banned or, otherwise eschewed by American society. Let's allow for the proper use of these things, but strongly discourage the improper diagnoses and prescriptions that at this point probably outnumber the correct ones.
Well, let's get into why it's so overdiagnosed. And in a sense, your whole book is about that. But let's get into that. Why is it so overdiagnosed?
Well, the term that I prefer to use, and I understand what you're saying, but the term that I prefer to use is misdiagnosed.
Misdiagnosed,
because
okay.
rather than look at children as sort of this amorphous epidemiological population, what I think we should do is look at each child as an individual, which of course is the point of psychiatry itself, but as an individual presenting with problems, and are those problems diagnosed and treated properly? Okay, the ones who are diagnosed properly, God bless them. Let's try to maximize the ones that are diagnosed correctly, which we've been told by the APA should be at least pretty close to 5%. All right, so let's get those right, and then let's stop short of misdiagnosing the kids. Now remember, misdiagnosis can happen in the other direction. You can have a kid who really does fit the ADHD construct, who is not helped in ways that we are pretty sure they could be. That is a misdiagnosis also. We want to maximize the correct handling and minimize the incorrect handling. And so I prefer not to use the word overdiagnosis. Now, of course, for things to be reasonable, the total diagnosis rate would, in fact, have to go down. But we need to look at each situation individually, which, of course, we can't do in detail. But we need to understand that each of these kids, they're a pixel, a real pixel in what makes up the larger picture. And so we need to look at the pixels more than the larger picture in order to see what's really going on and pursue reform.
Yeah. So in general, what is going on that the numbers are so high?
Well, there are just so many different factors, and that's why it has gone out of control as fast as it has. Now, keep in mind that the first congressional hearing on the overuse of Ritalin for what we now call ADHD was in 1970. This has been an issue for decades, and it's the same arguments over and over and over again. Now, why are there so many diagnoses beyond what's appropriate? My goodness, we don't have enough time in this interview to get into it, but you have the fact that the official definition has been continually loosened to allow more diagnoses. For example, in 2013, the new definition of ADHD, or tweaked definition, if you will, no longer said that the child had to be impaired by the behaviors at issue. Those behaviors had only to interfere with the normal development of the child. And interfering with normal development is a hell of a lot more inclusive than impaired. Okay?
Yeah, it's very fuzzy and loose.
Yes, and now there is going to be some fuzziness in all this, again, because of the lack of true diagnostic yes or no means. But the official folks who are in charge of this stuff insist on continually loosening the definition to encourage more diagnoses, or certainly to green light more diagnoses. So you also have the fact that doctors in general have very little training when it comes to children's mental health, and that includes ADHD. They don't really know what the disorder is. They don't know how to diagnose it properly, and this is in general. Of course, there are plenty of doctors who do a good job, and we don't want to throw them under the bus, but we wouldn't be in this mess if more doctors didn't know what the disorder was, know what it wasn't, what it isn't, know how to diagnose it properly, and it takes a very long time to do a proper diagnosis, know what the medications are, how they work, and how they work in any kid, not just an ADHD kid. Parents need to be armed with similar information so that if a doctor isn't doing the right job, the parent can say, all right, wait, I think we got to stop and slow down here, because any doctor who makes a diagnosis in 20 and 40 minutes it's basically malpractice, okay? Now, of course, you have the issue of big pharma. And while I tend to not throw the meat of this problem at their feet, I believe that it really does start with the doctors, because it's the doctors who make the diagnosis. It's the doctors who prescribe. Big pharma does not diagnose. It does not prescribe.
But it does advertise heavily.
They do. Okay. But, I don't think a lot of, just because they advertise heavily, every business enterprise stretches the uses and benefits of its product, up to and including, a York peppermint patty does not actually whisk you to the Yukon.
But I love those.
Yeah, I mean, and no matter how many Bud Lights you drink, you're not necessarily going to be draped with, good-looking women instantly. That's just not how our society and advertising works. Now, that does not excuse what Big Pharma did in this case. More directly, they ran ads for both doctors and then ultimately the general public, geared towards exaggerating the benefits of the medications, completely misrepresenting what the diagnosis truly was and what the condition truly was, and minimizing, and perhaps the better word is covering up, the downsides, the side effects, and the dangers of the medication, which are real. The benefits can be real, and the dangers can be real. It doesn't have to be one or the other. More silently, we have allowed as a country to let industry, and in this case, Big Pharma, basically co-opt entire medical fields, specifically psychiatry, where almost all of the influential studies, maybe not almost all, but a good portion, I would think at least a majority, of the influential studies done in ADHD, particularly those having to do with medication, okay, were conducted by university-affiliated researchers, Harvard University, University of Massachusetts, Cal, Johns Hopkins, Duke. And you think, wow, a study conducted at Harvard University said blah, blah, blah. Well, the problem is that the researchers in general, not in all cases, but in most, have been enriched by big pharma with either grants for that type of work, speaking gigs, 6, even 7 figures being paid to come up with the studies that they then use to sell the drugs either to other doctors, and I don't mean literally sell the drugs, but sell the concept of the drugs to everybody from doctors to parents to the government. And we've allowed big pharma to, just like I said, co-opt, or some would say hijacked. In fact, I said hijacked. The field, to the point where no one really knows exactly what ADHD is anymore, because it has been so twisted and contorted by profit motives of some other people. Again, that is not the only problem here, but it is a major force encouraging many more improper diagnoses.
Well, your book makes it clear that there's plenty of responsibility to be spread around, and big pharma gets a piece of that, but also parents maybe get a piece in their sometimes over eagerness, I guess, to have a well-behaved, wonderful child.
Well, look, there are a lot of families which are struggling out there, and children who are struggling, and we have to allow for some of them some sort of appropriate number to fit what we call ADHD, where there's no other explanation. It isn't anxiety. It isn't sleep problems. It isn't bullying at school. It isn't the parents' recent breakup. My goodness, a real thorough investigation and diagnostic procedure what's come into focus is that, hey, this really might be ADHD, and that's fine. Part of the problem is that the medications which help severely ADHD children appear, at least, to slow down, to stay on task better, to be more self-controlled, and to concentrate more, to pay attention more. Now, it does that in anybody. It's not just ADHD kids who feel those effects. Amphetamine, which is basically Adderall and Vyvanse, and methylphenidate, which is virtually identical and is Ritalin and Concerta, those chemicals have the same effect, pure effect, on any human being. Not everybody reacts that way, but it's not a test for ADHD. Okay. Now, the improvement in ADHD kids will be more visible and perhaps more therapeutic because there is so much room for them to improve, and there have been so many troubles caused by deficiency in those areas.
Yeah.
But anybody will basically feel more attentive, more invigorated, more willing to persist on tasks that they would not necessarily otherwise. And that can be generally it's for work, generally schoolwork, but also other professionals have been known to abuse these drugs as well. And the problem, or one of the problems, is that many physicians and also many parents will, basically say, all right, well, maybe it's ADHD. Let's give them this, let's give Johnny some Adderall and see if it helps. Well, the problem with that is that it's going to help anybody. It does not help ADHD kids uniquely. And so you might as well be saying, well, let's give him some platform shoes, see if he gets taller. That's not how it works. Just because it works on you does not mean you have ADHD.
Yeah.
And
now, one of the interesting things that you highlight is the abuse of this by students in graduate school, undergraduates, who need to cram for an exam, let's say, and they find, even way back when I was in school, I think there were people who were taking some version of speed, over the counter, dexedrine, over the counter stuff to study. I actually remember now, I didn't recall that until right this moment, that I actually did try it. And I still got sleepy when it was time to go to bed, and I slept.
Well, hey,
I couldn't cram.
People just get so wired that they can't stand it.
Yeah.
They can't sleep, and they're like, ugh, this is not me. I mean, there's really a wide range of reactions, but the general feeling among many college students that these things help keep them awake, help keep them focused, help them feel at least like they're getting more work done. This is something that's been around for a very long time. It may be getting worse now, but the first article about college students abusing what is essentially Adderall was printed in Time magazine in 1937.
Really?
Only a few years after the product, Benzedrine, came out. Now, Benzedrine became Dexedrine, and Dexedrine essentially became Adderall. They're all tied familially to each other.
Yeah.
And so
I've read articles about Adderall, and it seems like it's as if it's a new thing that's burst on the scene, and somehow that's the one of choice for not only for college students but for attorneys and other people who need to be really sharp.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so characterizing this is like, oh my God, what's going on? We need to understand that this has been a cultural phenomenon for more than decades. Mm-hmm. We need to understand what is compelling people to seek this essentially performance enhancement. That's a dangerous thing to say, because even though they're called smart drugs by many people, these medications do not make you smarter. They do not improve cognitive function or functional memory. What they do, as I said, is increase wakefulness, increase tolerance for what would be considered, tedious or tasks that you don't want to do. It's a remarkable product, and it's very seductive, because particularly as society gets faster, as society demands more from people, you have to work more hours, you have to compete with a lot of different kids for colleges or different, cultures for jobs. You keep having to do better. Well, some people are going to run out of wiggle room and look for help beyond what is really healthy and appropriate. Now, myself, my version of this is coffee, and I don't say that lightly. I am addicted to coffee. I cannot function properly. In fact, I will give a shout out here to my friendly neighborhood Starbucks. And so what I'm saying is that I need something else too. The difference is that coffee is not a controlled substance. Coffee is not addictive in the same way, does not have the same dangers of addiction, of habituation, as Adderall and Concerta have. I mean, those things are class 2 controlled substances, which is basically the highest classification, for a reason.
Do they turn out to be gateway drugs in any way?
Well, there are, plenty of cases of, it's hard to have hard data on that. And I think we want to be careful about suggesting that, anyone who puts a tab of Adderall on their tongue is going to become a speed freak. That's just not how it works. But there are people, and particularly given our new understanding about the genetics of substance abuse disorders and things like that, people generally like the feeling of these things, the invigoration it gives them. Not everybody. You sounds like you didn't have that type of reaction.
No, I didn't.
But people like this stuff, and so they can become addicted. And not 7-year-olds, okay? 7-year-olds who don't have access to the medication. I don't think we have to worry about them, getting addicted and sprouting horns. But we do have to monitor the fact that adolescents and young adults, or young adults in general, can really like this stuff. And when you start getting way too wired on it, not only do you run the risks of insomnia, of appetite health problems in that area, heart problems. But also you take enough of this stuff and you could begin hallucinating and go certain steps down to psychiatric breakdown if you really mess with this stuff and are one of the unlucky people who will have that reaction.
Yeah.
So, and then when you get so wired on the stuff, you start thinking, oh man, I need to come down. What can I do? And then you realize, well, Xanax or Valium can help me come down, or alcohol. And then you have somebody modulating their moods and functioning with these different substances. And so there's no question that stimulant abuse, ADHD drug abuse, can lead to substance abuse and trips to drug rehab. There's no question it can. Oftentimes, however, it will, you check into drug rehab because you're addicted to oxycodone or to Valium or to, what we've seen lately in the United States, heroin. And there are, a hell of a lot more than a non-zero number of cases where the cycle did begin with stimulants. Sometimes it's, students who are just trying to do better in school, think they will do better in school. And next thing you know, they do go down a very bad road.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the side effects that are associated with these? You say that in one way they're effective, but there may be side effects as well.
Sure, there are side effects to lots of different medications to
Sure.
degrees. So we want to be careful in our characterization of that. Of course, there are lots of different words. You can say side effects, you can say dangers, you can say risks. I mean, the connotation of these words is very important. But so what are the possible downsides? What are the costs of, what might be improvement in some people? At therapeutic doses, you have sleep disturbance, appetite suppression, and in rare cases, hallucinations. Okay, it's not just if you use the drug properly. About 1 out of 500 children who participated in the clinical trials of a lot of these drugs in the 90s and early 2000s, I think it was, experienced hallucinations, either feeling kind of things crawling under their skin or hearing things that weren't there or seeing things that weren't there. Now, that isn't the end of the world. All it means is stop the medication, all right? It can be scary, no doubt, but you just need to watch out for this stuff. I am not trying to discourage people from using the medications following a proper and thorough diagnosis and with full knowledge of everything to look out for. But we need to tell people what to look out for. There are some doctors out there who go running around saying that, Adderall is safer than aspirin, which is simply asinine, because what they mean is that, there are, a lot of deaths from gastrointestinal bleeds from aspirin, but that's when the aspirin is used in high daily doses to deal with heart issues. It's not just the 2 pills you take at night for a headache, but of course that's the way most people will interpret it. And so we need to be very careful. Even when the drugs are used in therapeutic doses, there are a lot of things to look out for and a lot of things to monitor. Now, if you use it well beyond the therapeutic dose, then you're playing with fire, because then you run the real risk of not only the same side effects, in considerably higher amounts, but then you really run the risk of addiction and substance abuse beyond the stimulants themselves. And so I think a lot of this comes down to making sure that the people who get the medications are properly diagnosed and understand how to use the drugs properly. Unfortunately, right now, you have situations where adults or college students who want to use these things for studying or for work, just, make an appointment with a psychiatrist. And way too often the psychiatrist is like, oh, okay, maybe you have some ADHD. I'll write you this prescription. Tell me how it goes.
Yeah, it's easy to get.
It's so easy. I mean, people joke that all you have to do is wear a suit to the psychiatrist and they'll say, oh, well, he couldn't be pulling a fast one. The doctors in general, there are a lot of doctors out there doing a good conscientious job, but there are way too many who are doing a crummy job. And we need to figure out, it would be nice if we could figure out who those people were and get them to cut it out.
Yeah. What about non-pharmacological interventions into ADHD? Do those exist?
Well, sure. There are, many different ways of coming at ADHD through more conventional behavioral therapy. Talking with the kid, helping them learn better organizational skills, better time management skills. A lot of this really does start with the parents. I'm not saying it's bad parenting. I'm saying that if a child is really struggling in these areas, then a parent or parents can learn better ways to deal with the child, better ways to accommodate these traits, better ways to organize the home and have the kid learn some better time management skills. These things are not panaceas. They don't always work by any means. And they generally don't work as fast as the perception that medication does. Mm-hmm. Right? Medication basically almost literally works overnight when it works in the ways that people have wanted it to work. And that's very seductive.
Yeah.
And the expediency that we value so much in America today, it's not surprising that people say, well, let's see. I can either go through lots of therapy sessions that cost a lot of money, and I have to drive 40 miles to the nearest behavioral pediatrician to learn about it, and I'm not even sure if they take my insurance, or I can just try some Adderall and see what happens. It's the way it is. I hate it, and I know a lot of people who wish it was different, but it's not. And so there are a lot of forces that certainly subtly, if not just blatantly, encourage a parent to not pursue non-pharmacological interventions. Now, I also should say that a lot of research has suggested that if you do optimal medication therapy and optimal cognitive behavioral therapy without medication, one's medication only, one is cognitive behavioral therapy only, it's pretty clear that the short-term results favor medication. The long-term results, there is a lot of mixed evidence out there as to, what works, quote unquote works, using a lot of air quotes. For the people on the podcast, you can't see, but I'm doing a lot of air quotes. So, there is some truth to the fact that medication can work and work the way people want it to work pretty quickly. And that is not inherently a bad thing. I mean, isn't it nice that it works well? But unfortunately, it does distract people from two very important things. One, that behavioral therapy is really an option and might be preferred in certain cases. And two, it works well enough where people think, oh, well, the kid must have had ADHD because look, he's doing so much better.
Yeah.
And as I described earlier, that's insane and a complete misrepresentation of what these drugs do and are for.
Yeah. One of the things that you touch on in the book, I think, is that the incidence is higher among boys, and boys in general seem to be naturally rambunctious, very active, etc., and that our school system is one where we try to contain children and put them in a little box, and you only get to go out during recess for a short period of time, and the rest of the time you sit in your seat and you do what you're told, etc. And so,
well, I mean, I think it's very complicated.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that it's certainly been known for a long time that to the extent that, hyperactivity, of course, is subjective. What's too much? What is beyond rambunctious and gets into the realm of the clinical and medically significant. We can all argue where that bar should be, but we need to acknowledge that there is one of those bars. And so let's figure out how to separate one from the other. But I think it is true that to the extent that there are some kids who are on the bubble, who are near the bar, if I may mix metaphors, who are just really rambunctious and very difficult and won't sit still and won't pay attention. Unfortunately, there are increasingly fewer outlets for those children to behave in ways that are more natural to them, whether it's recess, whether it's gym, whether it's artistic stuff. I mean, we tend, and also let's remember the class sizes have grown to the point where a lot of kids can't get the individual attention that they perhaps once did. And so all these factors are making, squeezing the spectrum of tolerant behavior, so that more and more kids just don't fit in that. And when the forces act upon them, they act out. And that doesn't mean they have a congenital brain disorder. I mean, the human brain, sometimes they might. I keep having to say this over and over. Doesn't mean like, oh, well, these kids are just being boys. No. A lot of them have real problems. And a lot of them, may have ADHD, and God bless them. What I'm talking about are the cases that have been, what's the right word? I don't know about minted, but sort of have come about from the choices that we've made about what we expect from children and what we demand from them in these educational settings. The human brain has developed over 10,000 years. And it's only in the last 100 that we have demanded every 7-year-old, 8-year-old brain to sit still and pay attention for 7 or 8 hours a day. Some brains are simply not wired for that. It doesn't mean they're bad kids. It doesn't mean that they're even necessarily disordered. It does mean that we need to accommodate the variance in kids' behaviors and personality, because we're just creating a lot of this problem beyond the kids who really do fit the clinical picture of ADHD.
Yeah, you mentioned different brains, and I'm wondering, if ADHD has been placed in the sort of neurodiversity movement. That some other diagnostic categories kind of say, hey, this is our brain, this is who I am, this is how it works, and I just have a different kind of brain that society needs to get used to.
Well, look, I mean, that's of course something that somebody can express as they get older and older.
Not kids, I know.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. A 7-year-old kid.
Right.
That's part of my interest in this issue is that, if you're a 24-year-old young man and you feel you have ADHD and you're pretty sure you fit this, and you go to the doctor and, hopefully you get a decent diagnosis, and you say, all right, I guess that's me. I guess that's always been me. And I, probably am going to take this medication for it. That's, an adult making an adult decision about his and then her health. I think with a 7-year-old, you have the issue of no informed consent. The child doesn't necessarily know or understand what it is that's going on. And that's where a lot of my compassion comes from. Now, of course, sometimes kids, it's just, tough noogies, man. You've got this medical issue and you need to take medication for it, or we say you need to take medication for it. And that's just the way it is. But I do think that we discount the effect that the mere diagnosis and message can have on a child, or the prescription, pills for it. Because while not every kid reacts this way, but kids think there's something wrong with me, and they need to fix it. And then they see on the internet that this is a lifelong, life-impairing, condition that can lead to, school failure and high divorce rates and car crashes. I mean, there's like some pretty bad, stuff out there. And, kids aren't stupid. And a diagnosis, whether right or wrong, but it's particularly, it's informative and important when it's correct, and downright tragic when it's wrong. It changes their personal narrative forever. It changes their self-image. And maybe in the cases where they really do fit the ADHD construct, that's just something that that just is part of the cost of handling it what we consider properly. That's just the way it goes. But we don't seem to be caring a lot about delivering that message to kids who really don't fit the construct and who shouldn't be told there's something wrong with your brain when there isn't.
Yeah. One of the things you discuss is that there is an advocacy group out there that's been around for some time, and the acronym is CHAD. I don't remember what that spells out. Do you?
Children and adults with attention deficit disorder.
Okay, yeah. Tell us a little bit about that organization and its impact for either good or bad or both.
Well, I mean, I think in general it's done good. It started out as an advocacy group, as parents who felt, and this is in the mid-1980s, who felt as if their child's ADHD or ADD at that time was not being respected by other parents, by teachers, by the educational system in general, and needed to discuss with other parents what they were going through, what opportunities are there for accommodations to get schools to appreciate the situation they felt their child was in. Now, part of the problem with these groups is that while they start out well-meaning and remain well-meaning, pharmaceutical companies who will benefit from higher rates of diagnosis, with more parents feeling better about getting the diagnosis, with more incentives for parents to get the diagnosis for their children, the pharmaceutical industry isn't stupid. And they donate lots of money and other things to these groups because it helps expand the market. I'm sorry, that's just what it is. And now CHAD, not from the absolute beginning, but early on, made the decision to accept lots of funding from Ciba-Geigy, which was the manufacturer of Ritalin, which was basically the only medication used at that time for ADD. Dexedrine was some, but generally it was Ritalin. And they didn't tell anybody. They didn't tell the Department of Education when certain public service announcements and other materials were being done. They didn't tell parents that, actually we're receiving significant funding from the makers of Ritalin. And we're making lots of statements about how important Ritalin can be to your child when in fact cashing checks from the manufacturer. Now, this is not uncommon among advocacy groups like this, okay? So it's not just CHAD, but they didn't do a wonderful job of messaging. And it was in a PBS documentary in the mid-90s that these relationships and this mishandling was exposed. Now, recently they have gotten better, okay? I think that part of the challenge, they've gotten a lot better. I really want to be fair there. But of course, their focus is on the people with ADHD and serving them through education, through advocacy, through lobbying, for lack of a better word, through information. That's their responsibility. Unfortunately, they and all the other groups did too good of a job, and people became too interested in getting a diagnosis. And they didn't realize that their ranks were being diluted by people who really didn't have the disorder. And that, in this new environment, has been what is partly corroding people's respect for the disorder. Because 15% of American kids to get diagnosed, I mean, how rare, how awful can it be? If they kept it to the severe cases that it really was supposed to be, then people would probably respect it a lot more. And so unfortunately, it kind of backfired. CHAD did a very good job in changing the image of the diagnosis, in helping parents and kids involved with it get along better. And that's not inherently a bad thing. I think they, along with lots of other people, were blind to, or maybe turned their head away from what became horrible misuses and abuses of the system.
Do they like to claim celebrities, historical figures in the past, and say these people have had ADHD, or are there?
I think that a lot of people, I am incredibly nearsighted, okay? And it was fun for me to learn that Specs Toporser, a Cardinals player, was the first guy to, wear glasses. And George Sisler wore glasses too. It's nice. It's very comforting for people who have things that they don't really like about themselves to know that other successful people, hey, wow, he had it too. Neat. Yeah. Okay, or this guy's from my hometown. Aaron Sorkin grew up in Scarsdale, where I'm from. Like, that's really cool. I dig that. And so, like many other medical conditions, it could be diabetes, it could be cancer, it could be all sorts of things. The people sort of in charge of ADHD appearances will say, hey, look, let's find some celebrities who will openly discuss their ADHD with kids and other people to help them feel a little less worried about it, to feel like they're in, good company. One of those is Adam Levine from Maroon 5, who's about as great a celebrity as you can get at this point.
Yeah.
The baseball player Shane Victorino, plenty of other current celebrities, Ty Pennington, although that was a big mess because he did appearances without saying that he worked for Shire. But so that's not inherently such a terrible thing. What is terrible, in my opinion, is for groups, and it goes well beyond Chad, by all means. I don't want to throw this at Chad's feet, but these ADHD, somewhere in between advocates and mavens, have written lists of people who, had ADHD, and they literally include, John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Albert Einstein, Rachmaninoff, Galileo, Isaac Newton. It's preposterous. Socrates is on one of these lists as someone who had ADHD too. It's so irresponsible, and that's one of the frustrating things, is that this disorder could be handled in a reasonable way, allowing the kids, people who really do fit the construct, to get evaluated, get identified, and helped. Wonderful. But long ago, the people in charge lost their way and started doing things that, let alone in retrospect, right now, they're absurd. They completely misrepresented what the diagnosis is supposed to be, what the medications are supposed to be for. And unfortunately, they've lost a lot of credibility now because they have mishandled it so much in the past. I hope that we can get past that, and everybody, including Chad, can start addressing the fact that, as important as it is to make sure that a really ADHD kid is identified, it's also diagnosed, it's just as important to make sure that a kid is not diagnosed with ADHD when that is the appropriate action. Because when you get those wrong, they're both mistakes. They're both costly. And it's time we consider them both. I don't see a whole lot of people doing that.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you've got another book that you're working on.
Nothing, too concrete at the moment. Most people don't know that I am more of a math enthusiast than anything else. I have a mathematics degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and I've written extensively on statistics and hope to be a high school math teacher before.
Yeah.
So my next book will probably have to do with mathematics.
Okay. And I don't know if I mentioned this. I was an undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania as well. We can compare notes off camera.
Go Quakers.
Off microphone. So I think we're kind of at the winding down place here. I wonder if there's anything more that you'd like to say that maybe you haven't got out there, or some kind of a wrap-up statement.
Well, I just hope that people understand. So many people are going to be listening to this saying, you're just disrespecting my kid with ADHD. You just want to stigmatize him more, or you're anti-medication. And I'm doing none of those things. And if you listen to what I'm saying, I am not saying that this is all a crock by any means. Just because other people have said it doesn't mean you can think I'm saying it. What I'm saying is that let's play by the rules. Let's help the kids who need help in this way. And the kids who don't really have ADHD. Let's help them in the other appropriate ways. And the kids who really don't need help, who are just faking it, let's try to make it where they don't do that, or they certainly don't get the diagnosis. It's really not asking a lot, because right now, 11% of current children have received a diagnosis of ADHD. 15% will ultimately. But 11% of kids 6 to 17 right now have been diagnosed already. If that number were to go down, merely 1%, if we were to just get that little, just easy to get at, reasonably easy to get at, that marginal population, and say, you know what, these kids might have problems, but it's not ADHD. We were to get that down, 1%, that's 600,000 children who won't be told, who won't be given the wrong diagnosis of a lifelong psychiatric disorder. And I don't see how anyone can argue against that type of reform. Why is, we're not going to, I'm not saying destroy the construct. I'm not saying stop diagnosing and treating ADHD at all, but just do it a little smarter. That's it.
Okay. Well, that's a good, strong closing statement. Alan Schwarz, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Well, it's my pleasure. Anytime.